quite cool. But now I'm right on top of it. I'm touching it. Good afternoon. Fortunately, you're not going to have to listen to me speak after this at all. In a moment, the choir is going to sing Siku Cheros, and off we go. Janet requests that we not applaud, but hold our appreciation in quiet. And I just want to say, before we begin, what a tremendous privilege it is to be part of this event today. And I feel no matter what happens, it's going to be glorious because it's for Stephen. Thank you.
Does this sound unnatural? Raise your hand. Let's try a compromise. All right, well, my name is Duncan MacIntosh. First, maybe we could start not with applause, but maybe some jazz hands for the amazing band. I was a colleague of Stephen's for 40 years. I'm a professor of philosophy in the philosophy department where he was as well. And Stephen basically trained me as an academic. And one of the things he taught me is that an exam should be a continuation of instruction. And I feel like this service should be a continuation of his life, which would in part involve some examination, deeper questions. So I have two questions I want to begin with. The first is, a good man is just passed on. Why are so many of us smiling? And the second is, Stephen taught me that as a professor in the Maritimes, I had a duty to teach at least three things. First, Maritimers are poor not from laziness, but because they got a bad deal from Central Canada. Second, abortion was okay. And third, there is no God. What was Stephen's position on religion by the end of his life? Those are the two questions I want to talk about. In preparation for this talk, I've been asking people about their relationships with Stephen. Nobody had a bad thing to say about him, so it falls to me. First, I want to talk about the hair. I don't know if those of you who know him for a long time will remember that, say 30 years ago, he'd get exactly one haircut a year. So for the first 2 months of the year, he would look like somebody applying for a job with the Toronto Police Force. And then for the last 10 months of the year, 12 minus 2, 10 months of the year, he would look like a Scottish person culturally appropriating an afro. But that's all right. Scottish people can have woolly hair too. Proof he was Scottish and he sometimes had woolly hair, so I think that's okay. Next, I want to talk about the purple suit. Isn't it an exercise of vanity to wear a purple velvet suit from Carnaby Street to a party? If Ross will just stand for a second. You can see the top part of this suit. Apparently only the top part fits, so I'll leave you to draw your own conclusions on the bottom part. But what's wrong with wearing a purple suit to a party? A sense of occasion, so that's no good either. What about this? Stephen was sometimes late. We'd all go to a philosophy colloquium, which was 2 hours of listening to somebody talk and then us talk about that, and we'd all go for drinks after. Another 2 hours with a sour stomach having eaten only potato chips. And we'd all decide to go out for dinner somewhere. And I'd say to Stephen, so you coming to dinner? And he would say, let me check with Janet. And this process would take an hour and 10 minutes. The longest hour of our lives. And it just made me crazy because this happened 48 times a year. We always went to the same place after the colloquium. They got to check the time. But now that I have a family of my own, the only puzzle is not, why are you always so late? The puzzle is, how are you ever able to be on time? It's just impossible, right? If you have a life, especially a wife you love and who's a great part of your life and want to include things. All right, so the roast part of these remarks is clearly going nowhere. I'm just going to move on. He had such a good, full life, productive to the end, lionized in its last years. There was a conference held in his honor. It seems almost churlish to wish that he had lived further. We might as well be wishing that people were immortal. In his case, I wish that were true. The universe tried to kill Stephen at least 4 times. There's a 5th time, he and 7 other friends decided to march across the Great Tobiatic Wilderness about 20 years ago. I regard that as almost equivalent to a suicide mission, but anybody who decides he can't is clearly not in their right head, so you can't fault him for that. So what were the 4 times the universe tried to kill him? First time, 20 years ago, in his first health crisis, then with eyeball cancer of all things, and then by fracturing one hip, and then another. Finally, when the score was Stephen 4, universe 0, I think Stephen decided to spare the universe from further embarrassment and took matters into his own hands. Eulogy is necessarily autobiography, but Stephen was so consistent and vivid in his many roles that any story from anyone about any part of his life is likely to resonate with everybody about some part of their relationship with him. Stephen was many, many things, amongst them a boulevardier, somebody who likes to sit in a cafe of an afternoon and just pass the time with friends. It was the role I first met him in at a conference in Montreal way back in the mid-80s. This was 40 years ago. In this role, he was unsurpassed. His great gift for friendship, effortlessly companionate, was immediately on display. Time flew by, culture and scenery were observed. Conversation was both easy and invested, topics thoroughly considered. He went never far away. A sport jacket was jauntily worn, an example of how to be comfortable in Montreal culture was set. Bilinguality was in play, as was a philosophic commitment to the idea of the Canadian experiment in 2 cultures and 2 languages, defined in part as not American. No doubt a cigarette was offered and smoked, but just one, as slowly and sensuously as a fine cigar. The words rushed and Stephen were never uttered in the same sentence. Later, Stephen was chair of the philosophy department for a time and as graduate coordinator for what felt like 300 years, profession, Stephen liberalized our conception of what philosophy was. For example, as a philosopher of art, he could riff on sculpture that was built entirely out of hundreds of layers of paint. He was capable of accepting as a student essay in a philosophy of art class a dollhouse wrapped in audio tape. Hi, Ariella. You're here. In later life, he would give philosophically informed, deep readings of works of fiction, The Life of Pi, for instance. Stephen was known and loved for his silences between parts of thoughts. Dragonflies could be born, have babies, and die in these pauses. And the parts on each side didn't always successfully anastomose. But I found he did that much less in the last 10 years of his life. I don't know what happened. But in any case, that was never what I or many of us found most salient about his speech. What we found most salient is that he always had something worth saying, usually something humanizing, loving, moderating, something that respected shades of gray, something respectful or calming. And then, of course, there was the quality of philosophy. Stephen presented as a historian, a scholar, a philosopher of art. These are often thought as the softer parts of philosophy. His speech was sermonical and cadence. But very often he would come up with some precisely expressed, extraordinary thought made of steel about some hardball philosophy issue in metaphysics or philosophy of language. And one realized a deeply considered expertise behind everything that Stephen thought about and said. The flashing insight, in his case deliberative expression, was a false front for quickness of mind. He was a model in so many ways, not least in continuing to think, teach, publish, intervene in colloquia at a conference long after retirement. And he was always a model of how to have philosophical culture that should involve beer and billiards as much as lonely nights writing and intense debate in former gatherings. It should involve interest in people, acceptance of eccentricity, tolerance of personal issue. One cannot talk about Stephen, you can't talk about what he meant in our lives without talking about the rest of his family. In my case, for instance, his wife Janet got me through my German language requirement for the doctorate at the University of Toronto, patiently teaching me the basics at their kitchen table. Especially in the first decade or so of my career at Dalhousie's philosophy department, there were many dinners and parties at their house, many late nights with Stephen and Janet and graduate students drinking single malt scotch and listening to music through their extraordinary stereo, the lights low, lamps lit, favorite compositions played and discussed. I got a musical education from them, and their willingness to talk music with somebody who knew little about it, to take my observations seriously. I learned about Bach, Wagner, about whatever that fake cello thing is that Janet plays. I learned not to be intimidated by the many long and girthy flutes and recorders lurking like a stand of ferns by their piano. I had my first adult brownie at their place. It was extraordinarily tasty. It had no other effect on me, although I did talk for 3 hours about what a great brownie this was. I felt like I was part of their family. Stephen was a family extrovert, his children always present at otherwise adult parties. I remember Putty, also known as Ross, at various ages, when young, running through the great room in his pajamas, making weird noises. I remember these noises. I'm going to do them for you now. Ba-loop. Ba-loop. Then, decades later, him playing something amazing on his electric guitar. Now a teacher at the Shambhala Center after a continuing life of music, being a kung fu master. Sorry, it's kung fu. It's kung fu. I remember Maggie in her late teens and early 20s figuring out her life, now head of the Eulogy Action Center. I remember calm Emma, now interim chief of pediatric emergency at Killam. I remember them all trying on various lifestyles, various career possibilities, all with the curious love of their parents, always wholly emotionally supported. Stephen would talk about his children on any pretext or none. Children, all of whom inherited Janet's terrier-like alertness, and Stephen's combination of preciseness and fun. Stephen would talk proudly of his wife, Janet, and he thought of as a kind of indomitable superhero. Stephen's family was a model to me of what family life should be like. Stephen's voice was one of the great all-time dad voices, not unlike my own father's. Stephen and Janet's house was a model of what a home should be, ever welcoming. A home classically old but comfortable, full of little rabbit warrens, multiple staircases, a fabulous pair of great rooms for entertaining, a constant negotiation with miscellaneous non-human co-inhabitants of the house. I believe there was a reptile at some point behind the fridge. And then there was Stephen's honesty about his own life, issues he faced. As with my own father, I felt I constantly learned from him about the stages of life, how to navigate issues in a man's life, how to deal with health issues, the death of others, one's own mortality, relationships, friendships. And it was impossible to feel judged by him. I was a foul weather friend to Stephen. A colleague once called me emotionally vampiric. I tended to show up more when there was trouble. And I noted that even from his hospital bed during his initial round of health issues 20 years ago, his first and obsessional post-operational thought was how to protect his family. Our friendship got interrupted from time to time by distractions from my own life, and more recently by the pandemic. But even through that, we managed to have at least the annual tradition of a long meal out, roughly coinciding with me, Stephen taking me around to his golf club game, the Gaspers. They debated whether that was a good name for a club of people mostly in their 80s. And I talked from the point of view of my American think tank about the crack house that is the country south of our border. In the course of talking to him through his illnesses, I got to do 2 life reviews with him. One in his convalescence from his eye surgery, in which we read him with the other eye together the book, The Women Are Up to Something, about women philosophers on the ascendance in the great British universities during the mid-century Great Wars. So much of his life was at those universities that we got to talk about his 20s and 30s, how he got to see Pierre Trudeau at the Oxford Debating Union, how he could tell firsthand to me whether the novelist Iris Murdoch was as hot as she seemed to be in her photographs. The second life review moment takes us to the answer to one of the questions I posed at the outset. I said, Stephen thought philosophers should teach there is no God in the Maritimes. What was his position on that at the end of his life? I had by then begun going to church myself after a life long as an atheist with my wife, in my case not out of faith in religious metaphysics, but hoping to expand my community, and then almost immediately for the deep and moving reflections provided by our minister. Stephen had had an intense fear of death in midlife, resonating with Julian Barnes's book, Nothing to be Frightened of, on that theme. But by the end, he seemed utterly unafraid. Apparently on his last day, he was rejuvenate, good-humored, joyful in family rituals, singing the old family songs, surrounded by his loved ones, held and touched by his family in the end moments for which he seemed wholly ready and accepting, drifting off in a way untroubled and pleasant. In our last afternoon out for coffee before he managed to break a second hip and his confinement at home began, we talked about religion. And Stephen said some things that made me wonder how he felt towards the end. He thought that religion did death brilliantly. And in addition to connecting people in a community during life, it made us all have a sense of our connection with all the humans that have come before us and all the humans will come after. And its promise of immortality gave one at least the notional sense that one's life would continue to resonate, that one might persist in the way of soaring music and feeling of the life of the church at its best. The philosopher Peter Frederick Strawson wondered whether it was intelligible to think of someone's existing as a mere sound, as part of the choir of other people and their sounds. And so I think of Stephen's love of music, the deep, characteristic, and charismatic voice he brought to the human choir. And I draw my own conclusions. Did Stephen end his life as a believer? In the movie The Miracle on 34th Street, was Kris Kringle Santa Claus or just a nice old man? When I mentioned all of this to people, they began sending me proof of Stephen's atheism. Things he said in his 2006 ex-augural address from King's, or in his response to papers in his honor published just recently, or maybe about to be published, in Dialogue. Now, in his address at King's, he reviews various conceptions of what the life after death, if any, would be like. And here are the options. 1, nothing. 2, rest from all strife. 3, merging with the great world beyond, including the physical universe. And 4th, consciousness continued in an afterlife curated by a judging God. He definitely didn't like the idea of the latter. And furthermore, he invokes the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein's idea that to be a believer, one would have to live in a completely different way than an atheist would live. Or really how? Well, you'd have to have a relative in the ministry. Stephen had a relative in the ministry. You'd have to go to church. Stephen went to church. You'd have to sing in a church choir. Stephen sang in a church choir. You'd have to be mindful of themes of judgment and forgiveness. These were the themes about which Stephen spent his whole life writing. Where's the part about Stephen that is different from the life of a theist? The words, I believe. But according to Wittgenstein, that's the least important part. All right, I'm going to leave that one there. Public speakers must always give their audiences the hope that the talk will soon end. So I move on to the second question I posed at the outset. Why are we all smiling? I shall answer this question by taking attendance. And as I name some possible affiliations you might have with Stephen, please raise your hand if you are comfortable doing that. Wife. Just Janet? Child. Partner of a child. Grandchild. Sibling. Colleague from King's College. Colleague from Dalhousie University. Hockey player. Wow. Jogger. Singer in a choir. Churchgoer. Now I need to see all these hands now. Book club member. Golf club member. Friend. Neighbor. Other. Now I want you to raise your hand, but only mentally, if you can ever remember a time when you felt unjustly worse after talking with Stephen. I can read mine, so I know that no hand went up. I bet none of you raised your hand. And so we have our answer to the question, why are we all smiling? Because Stephen was just the loveliest person to spend time with. That's why. I will close with this thought. Friends are only episodically in each other's lives. Most of the time, one's friend is not there. And so even though Stephen is officially gone, for me, and this is a great luxury for me, not much has changed. No doubt this is vastly less true for his family. Still, Stephen was so vivid in our lives, and such a figure of love, that I expect many of us have only to think of him, and it feels like he is here still. The thought of Stephen is, and will always be, as comforting as a warm bath. Stephen, you brought richness and texture to so many of the dimensions of our lives. We're also very grateful to have known you, and in this life, we'll carry your memory and spirit forward. If you can't be here to be Stephen anymore, then perhaps some of us will take up the various parts of the model of a person that you represented, and try to be the best Stephen in the aggregate that we possibly can. Great, I think I'll more music. And in fact, Alice, are you introducing this? Oh, Alice McLaughlin. But not yet.
to see you all by way of sound check. Yeah, this is beautiful. And thank you for being here. As much as all this music is for my father, it's rings in my ears today one thing he once told me, which is that funerals are for the living. And in that way, this music is for us. And it's a beautiful thing to share. And in a more specific way, it's for Janet Ross especially.
and do philosophy with Stephen Burns for my entire life. I was asked today to say a few things about the musical choices today, both those you've heard and those to come. As is the case for almost everything I have done and everything I will do in my entire life, I do this with Stephen's voice in my head and his guidance on my page. In this case, I'm going to borrow heavily from what he once described as his first funeral, his last lecture upon his retirement, given to the graduating class of the King's Foundation Year program in spring 2006. So much of the music we'll hear today belongs to the polyphonic choral tradition that Stephen and Janet have loved so much and have shared so generously with, I suspect, all of us here, as the cornerstone of each and every choir they have ever sung in, some of which I was lucky enough to tag along for. Sicut Cervus by Palestrina and Civitas Sancti by William Byrd were both chosen today by Stephen. He also chose them for his last lecture, where he sang each of them with the help of Janet and their close friends, as they have sung them here and in a lot of places, including famously in the summer, I want to say of 1996, at Burns' backside in downtown Halifax, which was what we called the choir that sang standing behind the statue of Robbie Burns. I think polyphony is just right for Stephen and Janet because it is fundamentally a collective endeavor in which each voice gets its moment to shine, and through a tremendous amount of careful, complicated detail, executed with remarkable attention, it creates the illusion of stillness, of space, even of silence. Silence was the theme of Stephen's last lecture, and it is always a theme with Stephen. Stephen didn't just love choral music, he also loves string quartets, particularly the late Beethoven string quartets, which he praised specifically for their use of silence. As I said, his fifth lecture was titled The Sound of Silence, and he opened it first by referencing those string quartets, and then, because Stephen's tastes were ever expansive, he quoted from feminist folk artist Ani DeFranco, who once sang, "Half of learning to play is learning what not to play, and she's learning the spaces she leaves have their own things to say." Stephen always left space for each of us. Now today we heard not a Beethoven string quartet, but a Hayden string quartet. Stephen's very dear friend and another philosopher-musician, Jan Zwicky, wrote a poem about Hayden, in which she said, "It's as though Mozart can relieve us of being human for a while, but Hayden knows being human is all we've got." Stephen believed fervently that being human was all we had, but I think he would appreciate how the final notes of the rising lark motif in this movement remind us that humans too can ascend to extraordinary heights. Now, Stephen didn't finish the full Ani DeFranco lyric in his lecture, a small note, but she does go on to say, she's trying to sing just enough so that the air around her moves and makes music like mercy that gives what it is and has nothing to prove. Now, no one had more eloquent, more generous, and more merciful silences than Stephen Burns. And no one made music, or philosophy, or silence that sounded quite so much like mercy, which is why it's right that we just heard Ross sing the Sisters of Mercy. Now, there's lots of explanations for why this particular song. Stephen cared deeply about Canadian philosophy and Canadian literature, and wrote rather a lot about both. This included pieces about Leonard Cohen as one of our great Canadian philosopher poets. But Stephen's connection to this song goes back much earlier. Some of you may know Leonard Cohen wrote Sisters of Mercy about two women named Byrd and Lorraine he met in a snowstorm in Edmonton. Some of you may also know, as it happens, these women lived in the same house as Stephen when he was in grad school, I believe in the basement apartment. This fact has been a part of Byrne's canonical history for as long as any of us know, to all who know him. Another canonical fact about Byrne's history is that Janet and Stephen, Maggie, Emma, and Ross, their partners Archie, Georg, and Lulu, and the grandchildren, Maya, Rosalie, and Sophia, all make wonderful music in an enormously diverse and vast number of ways in all of our lives. And this is, and always has been, Stephen's greatest pride and joy. So there are 2 more works of choral music on the program today. I've already said a bit about the Byrd and its place in Stephen's lecture, but I want to quote the first 2 lines of the Bruckner. Many of you have had this Bruckner piece played to you. Stephen's former doctoral student, Warren Hayden, fondly remembers Stephen playing it for him. So it goes like this. Os justi meditabitur sapientiam, et lingua eius loquitur judicium. For those of you whose Latin is rusty, the mouth of the righteous utters wisdom, and his tongue speaks only what is just. Those of us who know Stephen's speaking voice and his singing voice will know just how right these words are to describe someone so wise, so just, and so generous, both in his words and in his remarkable, merciful, not actually endless silences. I'd like to wrap up by sharing with you some of Stephen's final words from his last lecture. He offered these as a valediction to the graduating class. So this is from Stephen. Do not hope too much that the future will resemble the past. Long before the ashes, old voices will fade away, but there will be new voices and new songs. My wish is that you enjoy them and profit from them. Now, Stephen is a dad, was always a dad, so he also offered some advice. Advice that I think will make sense of the penultimate piece on the program today. Stephen's very last words from the graduating class of 2006 were this: you can always get together with friends and make some music. This advice formed the core of Jenna and Stephen's family and their community that they have built and that is here today. So I think today we, Stephen's friends and family, his colleagues and teammates, fellow choristers and community, will end by making some music when we sing this hymn together. I think Stephen would have liked us to sing quite heartily. So when the time comes, please don't be afraid to belt it beautifully. And then, though who really knows, if not even Stephen does, what is an end and what isn't, we will have a familiar experience for all of us in Stephen's orbit. We will have done our piece, and then we will listen to someone pick up the threads of our voices and make wise and generous music magic with them, far beyond what we ourselves could do, as when Garth McPhee on the organ takes the choral melody from this hymn and riffs on it with a final Bach fugue. Thank you. Let's get together as Stephen's people and make some music.